it's over to you, my friend.
Right. Okay. So welcome, you guys. I'm so glad you joined us tonight. I am so happy that a dear friend of mine from church, actually, we've known each other, John, what, for 30 years-ish? Close to that,
I'll
maybe?
say 25 to make us both
Yeah.
sound younger than we are, but yes.
Okay. Well, I'm the oldest person on staff at camp now, and I own it. So anyway, we've known each other for a long time, and John was a faith partner for me when I used to teach the confirmation class, and the kids always loved when they got John as a faith partner because he would take them to movie premieres and special events that his job allowed him to be part of. So I'm really excited that for our words person, we have John Horn. And so welcome to Your Books at the Beach. We're happy to have you here.
I am very happy to be here.
Great. So let's get right into it. Do we want to show a clip first, just so people
Sure,
can
why
see
not?
you in the field? Okay.
Without
You know what
a
we've
lot of
got.
clothes on.
Okay, let's do that one.
Wait, which one are we going to do? One I don't.
We're the one where you got your butt kicked.
Okay, let's do that.
All right.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a stunt woman, Jessie Graff. Here we go.
Demonstration.
I will rise now, and you can kick me on the ground. Okay.
Sure. All right.
I'm ready.
Okay. I'm satisfied with that.
That was very good.
So also, you want to you want to make sure that your arm isn't blocking my target.
Okay.
But
Did you record that, Michelle?
Yes.
Let me see.
So were you physically injured in that, or were you just being a good actor?
No, I was a theater major in college before I became a journalist. So a little acting. Jessie, you might recognize her. She was on American Ninja Warriors. She's on whatever this new stunt show is from Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. But she was missing me by about that much. So she would kick as hard as she could and stop just short of my body. And we rehearsed it. I said, I'm not going to move. She said, don't, because then you'll get hurt. And it was just, it was a way to do an interesting interview about she's obviously on that show and she's also a stunt woman. So rather than just do a interview over the phone with somebody who's like, let's come out and exercise with you. She kicked my butt in pretty much everything. And then we recorded the interview in around those moments. But we did record her kicking me and knocking me down to the ground.
Perfect. So you mentioned that you studied acting. So when and why did you make the switch to journalism?
It was not planned. So I was a theater major at the University of California, Berkeley, which at Cal is basically a really good English major. The department is relatively small. There are probably 60 students, and I think Cal's classes were about 3,000 per class. So it's a school of maybe 12 to 15,000 undergraduates when I was there. And it was a very small department, and it was essentially a critical research and writing department. I really, really wanted to direct plays. I was not a great actor, and I recognized it, and I loved directing plays. And that's what I did the bulk of my junior and senior years. So I thought I would come back to LA, start work, trying to get a job in a theater, and slowly build my way up to becoming a theater director. And I moved back home, and I started doing some freelance jobs, and it became very obvious very quickly that it was going to take a very long time to get anywhere, even if I tried really hard. And I knew myself well enough to know that I wasn't really wired for that. So against that, I'd also played ice hockey at Cal, and play is a loose verb. There was an ice hockey team of which I was a member of, and I wanted to keep playing ice hockey. So PCC, the local city college in Pasadena, had an ice hockey team. So I have graduated from college, I'm living at home, and I enroll in a couple of journalism classes at PCC. I hadn't really worked in journalism at Cal. I'd taken some classes, but hadn't worked for the student paper because it wasn't really a priority of mine. So I enroll at PCC in these journalism classes to play ice hockey. And literally the week I enroll, they cancel the ice hockey team. So here I am, I'm living at home, I've got a degree, I've got time on my hands, I'm in these journalism classes, and within 3 months, I am the editor of the KPCC paper because I had an advantage. I mean, I had a college education, I had a lot of time, And I loved it. And I had maybe 8 or 9 people who worked with me on this paper. I took photographs, I wrote editorials, I covered sports. I mean, you guys are so spoiled in terms of layout. We had to measure every letter and every headline and like make sure the copy fit. We couldn't paginate, we couldn't wrap.
No.
Just laying out a story would take, 4 or 5 hours. I took the paper.
Counting characters just for the headline,
Yeah,
so
big
that you
T,
would
small
know
t.
if it, oh my God, the
Exactly.
worst, the worst.
So anyway,
bad.
the Pasadena City College Courier became basically my own newspaper, and I would work 70, 80 hours a week on it because I had nothing else to do and I loved it. And I was able to use the clips from the PCC paper to get an internship at the LA Times in the calendar section. And from there, I'd studied theater, so I kind of knew how the creative process worked. So I got a job in the calendar section at the LA Times, was hired in about a year after that by the Orange County Register to cover television, became an entertainment reporter for the Associated Press, wrote for a couple of magazines, Premiere Magazine, Newsweek Magazine, covered the film business at the LA Times for about 10 years, and then joined the radio station about 5.5 years ago.
Okay, so guys in the audience, you're welcome to post questions that you might want to ask John about. You know that he used to write for a paper, so you might have questions about things related to that. So let's ask him some good questions. So in the print journalism thing, when you're working for the LA Times, talk about some of the things that really, really are memorable for you that you go back on and you think that was just great, whatever it was.
Well, I mean, I think there's an expression that novelists use, and they say writing is terrible, but having written is great. And I think anybody who's honest about what it takes to report and write a story would admit that it's really difficult and it requires a lot of work. And I wouldn't say I was like the world's best writer, but I was always a very good reporter. And there are a couple stories. One I did at Newsweek, where I did a story about the Sony Studios, and you could Google this, Dave Manning, Sony Studios. It was a time where Sony invented a movie critic to make up quotes for movies that they ran in newspaper ads. And by crazy luck and some really hard work, I found that this guy was a fake, and I caught Sony on it. Dave Manning was the fake guy's name. It was somebody at Sony's college roommate's name, and they created fake quotes about really bad movies. So it's kind of obvious to spot that something was awry. So a story like that is really fun because you think, Hollywood is incredibly crazy, but to invent a movie critic who would make up quotes is almost beyond comprehension. And then the other story that I would say probably meant the most to me professionally is, along with a group of other reporters, we spent 1 year trying to investigate who was in the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. There it is, Dave Manning's story. There were satellite news trucks parked in our front lawn interviewing me for like MSNBC and CNN. So the LA Times, a group of reporters and I spent a year looking into the Academy membership. So the people who vote on the Oscars, about 5,000 people, the Academy doesn't announce the names of the voters, and they don't tell us anything about who they are. We had this hunch that it was a bunch of old white men, and the fact that the Oscars were very heavily tilted, and now this is well before Oscars So White, was very heavily tilted to those kinds of movies. So we spent a year identifying the age, gender, and ethnicity of more than 5,000 Academy Award voters. And we took those findings to the Academy. Their jaws hit the floor when we reported our findings. And the way we would identify people, everything was legal, but we went to some very creative lengths to try to figure out who was in the Academy. And then, somebody might be named, Chris. Is that a man or a woman? What do they look like? Is there a photo of them? And this is a little bit before everyone was on social media. So anyway, there's our story. This, I think, redefined Hollywood. It was a story that today still has consequences in the Academy, how the Oscars are trying to diversify its membership. The fact that Parasite won the Best Picture Oscar last year is I think, testament to the fact that the Academy is trying to diversify its ranks. So listen, I'm not reporting about, global threats, the pandemic, politics. I'm covering entertainment, but this is a story that is really meaningful about Hollywood, because the way that the Oscars celebrate movies matters, because if you don't see yourself represented on screen, you're not going to think of that career as something that you could aspire to. So if the Academy and Hollywood are only making movies about straight white men, it sends a very bad message to the rest of the country. So those are the two stories I would cite.
I've listened to your podcast a million times, the one that's on hiatus right now, The Frame, and you use the term Oscars so white regularly in your interviews. So when you think about the people that you're talking to now, are you encouraged by what maybe the people who are in the production seats, the people who are spending the money on movies are thinking about and trying to do? Or do you see it, especially with the pandemic shutting everything down, do you see it's going to be a long time before it's much more equal?
It's going to be a long time. I mean, and the data supports it. So even before the pandemic started, the number of women who got to direct a major motion picture, it was like 1 out of 20. And obviously women are half the population. You know, the kinds of parts that Latinos, that people with disabilities would get, the way that LGBTQ characters are depicted. I mean, there's a long history that Hollywood, I think, because of the pandemic and because of all of the outcries over not only our country's, systemic racism, but about representation in general, I think the studios are really taking a hard look at their own behavior. But the fact is that most of the companies are still run by a very narrow slice of the population. And those people have biases, conscious or unconscious, and they tend to hire people that look like them and talk like them. So even though Hollywood is committed to change, it's going to take a long time. And I'm hopeful that the trend is moving in the right direction. But Hollywood is a town that runs on fear, and it's motivated by profits. Its moral compass is aimed straight at the bank. So if Hollywood can recognize that if you make TV shows and movies that speak to a diverse audience, they're going to do better, they will keep making those. I mean, look at Fast and the Furious. I mean, this is a global phenomenon that is successful largely because of its multi-ethnic cast. Not because Vin Diesel is a great actor. It's because people can look at that cast and see themselves represented on screen, and that's why those movies are successful. Maybe people also like fast cars. But anyway, I think it's moving in the right direction, but not nearly as fast as it could or should.
So I think we have a question from the audience that Mike is going to pose to you related to this topic.
One of our audience members said, as we know, the 2020 election's coming up, John, it will likely be fraught with a lot of emotion. How, as a journalist, do you maintain your professionalism and not editorialize, even when you have super strong feelings? How do I make sure that coverage of something like the election or something else is balanced and many voices are heard while still being a good journalist?
I think it's a fantastic question. And I think it is a debate that is raging right now, because unfortunately, journalists are not held in very high regard right now. And a lot of polls suggest that they're not trusted. And it really depends on what kind of journalist you're talking about. So listen, I might do a story where I disagree with the opinions of the person I'm interviewing. And I think that's important. But here's where I think it's really essential. They're not always two sides to a story. So if you were doing a story, for example, about somebody who is behaving, let's just say it's a cop who has murdered somebody, killed somebody. Maybe there are two sides to what that story is. But if you start saying, George Floyd died at the hands of the police, that is a political statement. If you say George Floyd was killed in police custody, that's probably a factual statement. And it really depends on how you choose. It's really important to choose your words carefully. And I think if you listen to the people that I've interviewed, if you listen to the guests I've selected, it's very obvious to see what my political beliefs are, because I choose people that I'm interested in hearing from. I'm not going to book Tucker Carlson onto my show. I wouldn't have anything to say to him because
thank God,
because I don't believe anything that he says. That said, there are ways to talk about interesting issues. I think the most important thing is to make sure that you're not tipping your hand, that you let people say what they believe unless what they are saying is indefensible. And I think part of the problem in journalism right now, and this is a criticism that is leveled at the New York Times as much as Fox News, is you've got to be really careful about what the other side of the story is. I mean, I think everybody probably saw AOC go on the floor of the House and talk about how she was treated and how her female colleagues were treated. The New York Times, said she was enhancing her brand. It's like, what? Brand is like being treated like a real person and not being called an effing bitch? I mean, those kind of words are really important. What AOC did was not enhance her brand. She was calling out somebody who was behaving in a reprehensible manner. And her words were much more important than the New York Times' words.
Okay, so I want to get to, because one of the things that I know that we want to have our journalists hear about is your process. When you do an interview, when you get ready to interview someone or do a story on someone, how do you decide what kind of a story you want to come up with? And when you're going to go interview, where do you start? How do you do that?
I mean, I guess the most important thing, I'm going to say it a lot, is I prepare. I prepare so thoroughly, it's a little frightening. In fact, my editors and producers will often say, oh, you don't need to watch that. You don't need to do that. And I always say, nah, I got to do it that way. And here's the deal. If somebody is giving you their time, and it could be the director of a big movie, it could be a classmate that you're interviewing for your yearbook. If they are giving you their time, you have the obligation and the responsibility to treat that time as if it is a gift to you. And that means you're not going to waste their time. You're going to be prepared. You're going to know what you're going to ask about. You're going to understand something about them that is going to be interesting to talk about. And it doesn't mean you just kind of stumble in. You don't have to have questions written out. And sometimes I might have a lot of questions written out and not even look at my notes, but I know going in what I want to talk about. I know things that are important, and I don't necessarily need to use all of them, but I want to make sure that if this person is giving me his or her time, that I'm going to treat that time with respect. And that means if it's a movie, I'm going to go see the movie. I'm going to take notes about it. And if it's based on a book and I see where this clip is going, I'm going to read the book. So
That's right.
Can I set up this clip a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely.
So Nicole Holofcener is a filmmaker that I've admired for a very long time, and she's an independent filmmaker. You guys might not have heard of her. She makes kind of small movies, but almost all of her movies she has written and directed. So they're based on her own life experiences, and they're semi-autobiographical. So when she was younger, she was writing movies about marriage and falling in love. A little bit older, she was writing movies about having kids. A little bit older, about marriages ending and breakups. And she made a movie called The Land of Steady Habits. It was the first movie that she made that was based on somebody else's writing. It was a book that she adapted. So Nicole Holofcener came in to talk about The Land of Steady Habits, and this is what happened.
There's a scene in the film where Helene, played by Edie Falco, says to a girlfriend of hers,
"What did we do wrong? I don't know, maybe I babied him too much? I must have done everything wrong. When are we going to know if our kids are broken?"
When are we going to know if our kids are broken? And it's a really heartbreaking line, and it's not in the novel. It's something that you put in there. Why is that line important to you?
I told my kids that it was in the book. I was like, don't look at me like that.
You're busted. Because I read the book. It's not in there.
That's funny. Good for you.
She had said that she lied to her kids and that it was in the novel because she didn't want them to think that she thought that about them. It's the best moment in the interview. And it never would have happened if I didn't watch the movie and make a note. That's an interesting line. And then, so a little bit of a cheat, I read the book on a Kindle and I searched for that phrase and it didn't pop up. So I knew it wasn't in the book. So, and it wasn't a gotcha question. I wasn't trying to trap Nicole. I was just saying, why is this in there? And she gave this great answer. You heard her bleeped out. I mean, she was like, she turned bright red because I busted her, but I busted her about how she incorporates her own life and tries to protect her kids from how she thinks and sees them I thought it was a great moment. It never would have happened if I hadn't read the book.
So Mike, let's take another audience question.
John, Yearbook Advisor says, my students are looking at a book that has a theme very influenced by activism and the current moment. How do we make sure the yearbook, and I would add their coverage, uplifts and signal boosts voices without becoming too political or off-putting for all the stakeholders at their school?
That's a great question. I mean, you know, there is a limit, and I'm sure you guys know this expression, to doom scrolling, where you're just going through social media or the news and seeing what horrible things have happened. And it's important to know what's going on in the world, like how many new cases there are, you know, what are the statistics of, you know, police brutality against people of color. It's all very important. But I think if you're mindful of solutions and ideas and people who are making change, I mean, I think that's the thing that, you know, if you can uplift and celebrate people who have ideas and people who are inspired to bring about change. I mean, think about like Greta Thunberg and about climate change. I mean, you can cry yourself to sleep every night about how bad climate change is. And here is a warrior who is, you know, speaking truth to power. And what she's saying is distressing. But the fact that she is saying it and that people are listening to her is really important. So yes, I mean, you don't ignore the underlying issues, but I think you do look for people whose stories are meaningful and that they might mean something to other people. So we did an interview the other day with a trans woman. Her name is Janet Mock, and she worked on this series Pose, and she also worked on this series Hollywood. And the day before we talked to her at my radio station, we had unconscious bias training. So I was very attuned to talking about, you know, my privilege, what it represented, and I wanted to listen to what she said, and I didn't want it affected by how I saw the world. So that also means be empathetic to other people, understand their life story, and it may be different from yours, and have them share it with you. So I think it's tricky, but I do think you know it when you find it, and it can be realistic. But, you know, Janet Mock told me things about what it's like to be a trans woman in Hollywood. She's a Black trans woman. Can you imagine a harder person, a harder way to make your life in Hollywood than being a Black trans woman? And she has succeeded. So I listened to what she said and the obstacles she faced, and she was a very hopeful and optimistic person. So the story, the interview, which will run next week, is about why she's hopeful and about how she's going to bring about change. It wasn't about all the horrible things that had happened to her, of which there were many, but it was about how she was using this moment to bring about change and why her story was important for other people.
So when you're interviewing somebody and you need to ask a difficult question, how do you set that up? How do you gain their trust before you can walk into that? What's the process that you have for going there?
Don't start with it. Don't start with the most difficult question, because you can have a very short interview if you do. The people who you're talking to generally know that they're there for a reason. And it might be a new book or not a new movie or a new TV show that they're promoting. But they also recognize that you are doing a job. And even if it's a question that they are expecting, you don't have to hedge. And you can say, I just have to ask. Or if you don't mind my saying, this is something I've been thinking about. It's important to know that that's part of in my job as a professional relationship. If you're talking to another student, it's a little different, because I think the rules are fundamentally different if you're talking to a fellow student. I'm interviewing people who know that they are appearing on the radio or in a newspaper or in a magazine. They know what the deal is. And maybe there are things that they're not comfortable talking about. Well, they say, I'm not really comfortable talking about that, or if you not want to use that, please don't. And plenty of people have told me things that if I wrote it would be really bad for them professionally, but they trusted me and it wasn't relevant to the story I was telling. But when I have to ask a tough question, I will, because that's part of the job. Many years ago, the Walt Disney Company made a film called Powder, and it was directed by a convicted child molester. And the victim came down to the film's premiere, and I wrote a story about it and picketed the premiere. And I called up the Walt Disney Company and I said, why did you hire this guy? And they said, well, they found out in the middle of production and we told the kids, no, I'm sorry. We found out in the middle of production and we kept an eye on it. And I was like, really?
Wow.
A cast of children, you kept an eye on a convicted pedophile?
Oh, wow.
So I'm not going to not ask the Walt Disney Company why they hired this guy, because that was the story.
Yeah. Okay, let's take another
Footnote is
audience.
he's still working in Hollywood somehow.
Oh, wow.
Yep.
Let's take another audience question. Mike.
First, I'd like to register that there is at least one vote in the Q&A that says John Horn for President 2020.
Okay.
All right, there it is. John, what advice do you have broadly for student journalists who want to make a go of it professionally? A specific question also about students wanting to write about film professionally. How do they get a start in, elite Hollywood, this and that?
It's like many careers, and the catch-22 about journalism is you can't get clips or, a TV appearance until you have a job, and you can't get a job until you have clips. So the barriers to entry, this is why my experience at the Pasadena City College paper was so good. And I wrote every story for that student paper as if it was my last and made sure that it was as good as anything I could write. The most important thing, I think, is read critically. Read other journalists, read other interviews, know what you like, know what you don't like. It's okay to say, you know what? I don't like the way Terry Gross interviews people on Fresh Air. I don't. I think she talks too much. I think she doesn't get out of the way. There are writers that I really admire. There's a guy who writes at the New York Times named Wesley Morris. I think he's an amazing writer. So develop a critical eye about what is good writing, what is bad writing. Emulate the good writing. Don't copy it, but know what speaks to you. Avoid the bad writing. And like I said, when I was the Pasadena City College Courier, circulation 50, I don't know how many people read it. I wrote and edited every story as if it was on the front page of the New York Times. I wanted to be my best possible work. And a lot of people don't do that. There are kids who come in to interview for internships at KPCC, and I ask them, what do you think of the show? They're applying to be interns on our radio show.
And they've never watched. And they
haven't listened to it.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, next. And it's hard. I ultimately believe that good work will stand out, but it is hard to get that first, get in the door. But again, you're only judged by your most recent work. And that's why I think it's imperative to make every story you write, it's like true in school, your essay as good as it can possibly be, because somebody might pick it up and say, that's really good writing.
So you have the opportunity to interview a lot of really cool people, at least by the teenage standards. Are actors and industry people easy to interview?
Depends. Some are really tough to talk to. And sometimes I've interviewed Casey Affleck, who's terrible. Ben Affleck is great. Emma Stone is fantastic. Rooney Mara is terrible. Angelina Jolie is fantastic. Julia Roberts isn't. I think certain people are more outgoing and are happy to play along. Hillary Clinton, pretty good interview. Although she shot me a look I'll never forget. So Hillary Clinton made a documentary called, it's called Hillary, and Annette Burstein directed it. And we did a Q&A at the Sundance Film Festival. I can tell you when it was. It was the day that Kobe Bryant died in a helicopter accident, because I got out of the interview and somebody said, Kobe's dead. And it's a 4-part documentary series about Hillary Clinton, from the beginning of her political career to the election. And at a point in the interview, I turned to Hillary Clinton. I said, do you think you're paying the price for your husband's sins?
Wow.
And she looked at me and said, that's a tough way to put it. And I meant it completely. I would say, if more bluntly, if it wasn't for Monica Lewinsky, she would be president of the United States right now, but I didn't say it. Because I wanted to see what her answer would be. So she answered. She shot me a look. But I was prepared. I watched the documentary. I thought long and hard about what I was going to ask her. And I didn't ask that question at the beginning because I thought that would kind of set things off in a bad direction.
So if you're interviewing somebody who is just not giving you much of anything, but you know you've got a show and you know they're going to be on it, are there questions that you use to help warm them up? Or how do you phrase questions to help them give you an answer that's not monosyllabic?
Have a conversation. I always say, like, imagine you're like, this is somebody that's come over that you're having, you know, your parents invited over for dinner and you're curious about who they are. You know, talk to them as if they were somebody you just met, not that you're interviewing. The point of an interview is to have a conversation. And it's not to show off how much you know about them. It's to be curious and to ask questions and to listen. I mean, it's really important to listen and make sure that what they say, especially if it kind of raises another question, is worth following up on. I mean, you can ask somebody, like, you know, how was your drive up from San Diego to Los Angeles? And they would say, oh, I didn't drive, I took the train. And then if you said, well, how was the traffic? It just means you're looking at your questions. You're not listening to what they're saying. And some people don't want to talk. I mean, and so what are the basic things that they might want to share? I mean, what are the things that you have in common with them? If it's a classmate, like, what are the teachers they like? You know, do you have shared interests? I mean, again, go on social media. You're not there to bust them and say, you know, I was on your Instagram feed. I saw that you really like Taylor Swift's album, you know, and you should listen to it. Even if you hate Taylor Swift, if this person loves Taylor Swift and you're going to interview them, listen to the damn Taylor Swift album. Apparently it's good. It's not for me. So you have something to talk about. I mean, that is just like what you would do if you were being a good person. You would just be interested in their life and listen to what they had to say.
Okay, Mike, audience question.
John, how do you commit to standards of good journalism in a world where clickbait and the easy stuff seems to be winning the day? How do you break through? How do you stay true?
Well, I'm not sure I break through. I'm not sure I get the clicks that a lot of people do. I just couldn't sleep at night if I was chasing audience. I mean, I think it also means that the reason that we get the guests that we do is because certain things are going to happen. We're not going to ask about their personal lives because that's not what they're there to talk about. We're not going to take what they say and use it out of context. We're not going to say we want to talk about their movie, but really talk about their marriage. We're going to listen to what they have to say. We're going to be prepared, and they're going to come on our show. So maybe we're not going to get the same ratings as, you know, Entertainment Tonight or, you know, some gotcha story, but it does mean that those people are going to give us their time, because the only thing you really have ultimately to sell is your credibility. And if you don't have that, people aren't going to show up unless they're really desperate for publicity, and there's plenty of other places they could go.
Okay, so this is the last question that's come in that I want to ask you. How do you decide what to include and exclude in an interview, especially when the person would look bad? More specifically to your book this year, how would you print someone's opinion stating that COVID is a total hoax? What about someone that says something hurtful? For example, a student at our school said they were glad COVID was attacking the older population and those with illnesses because they take up Social Security funds and raise insurance prices. Do you print that with their opinion, even though it makes them look terrible?
I mean, I think that's a very complicated moral question. And if I were your yearbook advisor, I would say don't print it. And I would say there's two reasons for that. And the person who says COVID is a hoax, I mean, they're just wrong. You know, COVID is not a hoax, and it could mean the deaths of 250 million Americans. I mean, I think that's some estimates. So it's not a hoax. So if you're printing that, I mean, you're just printing something that you know to be a lie. But if somebody's saying hurtful things about how it's good that, I mean, what is the consequence of that going to be when that's published? And maybe that person doesn't care, but what is the consequence of that? You know, listen, if somebody in the White House said it, it is absolutely worth publishing, because that person is speaking on behalf of the government and they're speaking on behalf of you as a citizen of the country. If it's a classmate who is saying hurtful things what is the consequence of that? Do they get ostracized? Even if they're proud of that, even if it's the way they feel, does it advance anything? And I think it's a really tricky question. If an administrator said it, you should absolutely print it. If a teacher said it, 100%. But if it's a fellow student, what's the upside of it? I mean, it's sad that they would say that, and Mike, I'd love to hear your opinion on this. I would just say there's no upside. Outside in a professional media setting, it's different. In a yearbook, I think the rules have to be a little bit changed.
I've got to say I'm with you. I would want to take some time to keep on reflecting on it, John. But I do really appreciate what you expressed about the teacher and the administrator, that the power differential there, and that accountability piece that we want to entrust to our student journalists. I'm right there with you. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and imagine too that in the world we live in, this person in 10 years runs for city council and somebody finds the yearbook, or finds a picture of them in front of a Confederate flag. It's like, you said COVID was a hoax? I mean, they're 16 years old. I'm sorry, they don't know what they're talking about. I mean, they could regret it. Maybe you can say, okay, what do you think about the government response? Is Donald Trump doing a great job? Give me your argument for that. Maybe there's a way to say, I understand that you think, COVID is being misperceived. Let's think of something maybe that isn't as inflammatory. And again, it's just a negotiation. But again, the rules are different in a yearbook than they are in a newspaper.
So talk about one or two memorable interviews and what made them memorable, and the person you talked to and what that was all about.
Okay, I think we have another clip. This is a guy, a filmmaker that I met like on his first movie. It's we'll do 1917 after this. Do you have The Accountant?
I don't have that one.
Oh,
I don't have
Sam
that one.
Mendes then. Okay.
Okay.
So Sam Mendes, I know, a show of virtual hands. You can put your hand up. Nobody will see you. Who saw the movie 1917? Okay, a lot of people. So I was doing the Academy Q&A for 1917. So this is the official screening for the people who vote on the Oscars. So there's an audience of about 800 people on the other side of the stage, and they've watched this movie. I love this movie. But I've been warned that Sam Mendes, who is sitting next to me, the director, is a mic hog, and that he answers other people's questions. So I'm very intentional about making sure that everybody gets a question that in theory only they can answer, that Sam Mendes can't answer for them. So I think we have a clip of George answering one of the questions.
Well, he starts with that, and then we go to the production designer.
Okay.
Okay. Sam, how are you directing the actors? How close are you to them in performance because they're going a long distance? And how do you know, as a filmmaker, what takes are working? And because obviously you have your cinematographer, your editor who have to sign up, but what do you know, or what are you looking for that might be different from them in terms of performance? And how do you have conversation given the technical challenges that you're up against?
Long question.
Well, you're hoping that by that time it's pretty telepathic, really. I mean, you've worked so long, everyone as a group. And what the extraordinary thing was about this movie is that every single member of every department was engaged in every shot because they had to be. So there was none of that, well, this refers to this department, this refers to that department. Everybody was involved in everything from the very beginning. And even though the actors were rehearsing, across a 6-month period, all they were really doing was being part of prep from day one, which is what we would normally do. But we couldn't move without that sense of what their natural rhythms would be, the rhythm of walking, moving, running, the rhythm of speech. What you're trying to do on a daily basis is judge rhythm and tempo, which is something you would never normally do. But because I'm from the theatre, that's a more common experience for me, to judge the rhythm and the pace of a whole 2.5 hour story without recourse to cuts. But you've got so many more elements in this than you do with a play. Everything's moving all the time. The camera's always moving. The characters are always moving.
So
the landscape's moving. The light's changing. And you've got background too, and any number of things can derail you. So what I was doing was I was working off a very large monitor screen, which I had to, because I had to see every detail, because I didn't want to let anything slip by. And that meant that I was stuck in a van, as was Roger. And often we would be at the end of the scene or at the beginnings. Either way, they would be starting half a mile away and coming towards us, or we would be at the beginning and they would just disappear. And there were a number of times when I had to say cut and they couldn't hear me. They just carried on acting away down the hill and over the horizon, you know, blissfully unaware that that the camera wasn't on them anymore. I mean, and there were days. I mean, you've seen the movie now. There's a colonel who sits in his car in the Mark Strong scene, played by a wonderful actor called Bill McCabe, and you know, his experience of that was 3 minutes before he had his scene was hearing way in the distance, action, like that. And then eventually 2 minutes into the scene, someone in the, you know, AD hiding in the back seat of the car went, now. And then he did his scene, out came Mark, and he played his scene with George, and then off they went, and there was another 3 minutes went by, and eventually, and cut, like this. And after about 5 takes, I heard this rather forlorn voice looking around, said, Sam, I came trotting out, which again was over a hill, you know, and he said, where's the camera? And I said, it's just behind you. He said, oh, he said, I have absolutely no sense of where the crew, I can't see anybody. I don't know where the ADs are. There's no sign of a camera. I thought I was being punked, you know. And you know, and at the end of the day, bless him, he said, well, that was one of the most enjoyable but strangest days I've ever had on a movie. Because it was like being part of a reenactment. You know, he was surrounded by 300 soldiers in full costume, and everyone was completely focused and doing it. But there was no evidence that there was a movie being made, and that really tickled me. But that is sometimes what it felt like, you know, that you couldn't see the crew. And often, you know, George and Dean, you know, had no... There was no sense, because obviously we're shooting 360 a lot of the time, so we're hiding things where we're miles away.
There have been a fair number of movies about World War II, maybe not as much about World War I. I want to ask you a little bit about what the war means to you. Your film is not about the Battle of the Somme, where more than 1 million people were killed or injured fighting over a couple of miles of land. When you grew up, when you heard stories about World War I, what did it mean to you, and what do you hope this film means to people who don't know about what happened on those battlefields?
I grew up in Devon, and I still have a place in Devon, and all the little villages and towns in Devon have a memorial to the soldiers that died in the First World War and the Second World War, but I particularly remember crosses dedicated to the soldiers that died in the First World War. And sometimes you'll be in a tiny village and you'll see name after name the same, and you kind of like 5, 6, 7 or 8 male members of that same family died in that war, and a village is like a tiny little village in the countryside. And that not just sticks with me. If I go back, there it is. And so I really hope it's not a history lesson, but I hope it really inspires people to look into the war a bit more, and just because it was such a crucial event, not only in the history of Europe, but the way the world's changed since then.
And yeah, I agree. And there's something, you know, one should remind oneself that these men were fighting over a free and unified Europe, which in our country certainly at the moment would be good to remember. And on top of that, you know, the winds that were blowing before this war began are blowing again. And you know, it's worth remembering that a war that can get buried under a sort of avalanche of nationalistic cliches about us doing it all on our own was in fact a version of hell, and it's over 100 years, and I hope it's not forgotten.
Sam, Christy, Roger, Lee, Dean, George, thank you for bringing us your film. Let's talk.
So do you want to say anything at the end of that? I know you were, yeah.
So one of the things is, and if you know this movie, it was all shot in one take, or the appearance of one take. And Roger Deakins, the Man in the Silver Hair, who spoke near the end, won the Oscar for cinematography. So I had interviewed Sam Mendes and Roger Deakins for my show a day or two earlier, and I'd asked Roger that same question about World War I and what it meant to him, and I knew it was a really good answer. So I knew he was going to tell a good story. He was going to talk about the list of names and the families, where entire families, 6 members of one family, were wiped out in the war. I knew it was a good story, so I saved it for last, and I knew that was a good way to end the interview. But again, you saw Sam Mendes just kept talking, and I wanted to make sure that everybody got a chance to speak. But even though Sam went on for a bit, I wanted to end with Roger, and then Sam had this other, you know, like last thought. But I knew that Roger Deakins had a good story to tell, and I'd heard it, and I didn't say, you told me the other day about, I just pretended I didn't know the answer. There's a great expression that lawyers have, is never ask a question you don't know the answer to. It's not really good in journalism, but it was very good there, because I knew his answer and I knew it was going to be a good one.
My husband used to do that. He was the master of that in conversation, where he would ask questions when we were sitting with friends he absolutely knew the answer to, but it would draw them out. And he knew then how to follow up to keep the conversation going. And then he never had to talk about himself. He was the master of that.
Right.
So,
and even if you know that, even if you know something that you're not showing off. If you're interviewing somebody, you're not there for them to hear what you think. You're there to hear what they think. So even if you know the answer, and even if they're like trying to think of something, you don't have to complete their sentence, because it's more interesting if they figure it out themselves.
So question about your team. So the people you work with, and how do you create a collaborative team experience where people are working together? And if it gets dicey sometimes, what are the ways that you try to work through that?
It's a great question.
That happens on your book a lot.
I have, so the frame and the podcast that I'm doing now, the staffing varies, but it can be 5 or 6 people, maybe 7, and then maybe 3 or 4. I thank everybody. Every time we do a show, I'll send a note, and I'll send a note to them and their bosses. And I'll say, that was a great episode. That was so good. And I won't throw fits. I don't get angry. I do really good work. I'm prepared, and I expect everybody who works, I set an example by being prepared and by being professional and being kind and being thankful. So I lead by example, and I'm fortunate enough that almost all of the people who work with me have done that. I had a producer a couple of years ago, and it was clear she was very unhappy in the job and she wanted to leave. And I pulled her in a room and I said, listen, I know you're not liking the job, but if you want to leave and you want me to recommend you to your next employer, you got to step up, because you're going to be judged by the work, and you don't want people mad at you. You want to do your best work, and that's going to be the best way to get out. And she changed her work, and I recommended her for a job. So it's just like friends. I mean, just say, thanks for being there. Thanks for picking me up. Thanks for doing that. I am very generous in my praise, and I don't take any, and I don't need it myself. Fortunately, I don't need to hear other people tell me I did a good job. I'm just very collaborative, and if I'm stuck, I'll say, what do you think? And I listen to all ideas. I mean, do you think this is a good idea? Could we do it a different way? Was I terrible on that? Could I do it over? I mean, and so everybody, even though I'm the voice or I'm the presence, it's all about everybody else who works on it. And yes, I'm the person that people notice, but as long as they are recognized and they're recognized to their superiors, I think generally that works.
Well, we are almost at the end of our time. So I want to ask you one more question.
Sure.
And that is, when you're doing a story and how is it that you figure out what the story is that you want to tell? So you've got a new show, you don't know how you're going to fill the however many minutes that you need to fill. So what is your process as you build which stories you're going to use on any of your podcasts or shows?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about a movie, it's got to be a movie you like, because if you are interviewing a director or a writer or an actor and the movie's crap, by doing a story on it, you're basically saying this is something you should check out. So we're very, very careful about only doing stories on things we think are meaningful or good or interesting. So that starts it. And then it's often the case that we look for things that people might not know about. Everybody's writing about the next Marvel movie, but are people writing about the next really interesting documentary? You know, people might be watching and writing about The Floor is Lava, but are they doing a story on some independent movie that just premiered on Amazon? By the way, you guys should all watch The Vast of Night on Amazon. It's one of the best movies that's come out this year. And we did a story on it because nobody had heard of it, The Vast of Night on Amazon. So we say, like, what is something that we want to lift up? And then when we're trying to figure out what that story is, and this is true in writing a newspaper story, true in telling a radio story, if you've just interviewed somebody and you're trying to figure out what to write, how to start your story, if you were like going from that interview to your folks' house and your mom said, what did you do? It's like, I met this person, here's what they said. The thing that you're going to tell your mom about the interview is the thing that's going to start your story, because it's the most important thing. So if you ever like have writer's block, what am I going to do this story about? What would you tell your mom? Like, you went to a baseball game, you're doing this, and then like this thing happens. Like, that's what I'm going to tell my mom. So the thing that you want to share the most is what the story is going to be or how it's going to start. So that's not only the way that you tell the story, but the thing that you're excited about sharing. It could be a book, could be a movie, could be a TV show. It's like something you're excited about and think other people would be interested in.
Great. John, this has been wonderful. I hope that you're going to get your election team
I got to see if Kamala Harris, will Kamala Harris run with me? I want to see if she's available.
I really appreciate that you were able to come and join us. And I know that the kids and the advisors too really appreciate all of your advice and expertise. And it's been a really lovely evening. So thank you so much for being with us. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. And I will say to anybody thinking about journalism to study in college or as a profession, it is a great career. It is really enjoyable. It's incredibly satisfying. And more than ever, we need really good writers and thinkers in the profession.
Amen to that. Amen to that. So thanks, everybody. We have a prom coming up at 9 and a roundtable on crowdsourcing at 8. So don't miss those events. We'll see you soon.